Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Madison. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts, including from theathletic.com. He is Useful Human and frequent traveler to the Midwest, apparently. Arif Hassan. Arif, how was Indianapolis?
It was a city. It was better than I thought, honestly.
It was a thing. It was a noun. It was very nouny.
Yeah, I enjoyed the restaurants and bars. That was nice. I enjoyed the people that I hung out with. A lot of draft Twitter.
A lot of draft Twitter. It seemed like everyone was just kind of huddling together for a little while there.
Yeah.
I did see the message that Danny Kelly sent out that you described one player's reach as, quote, "I bet he gives good hugs."
Well, I mean, I've never cared about like wide receiver arm length. You know, I haven't found any tests that have found that mattered. Obviously, in real life, you know, that probably matters, but it seems like all the other requisite wide receiver skills kind of overwhelm it, so it kind of reached us. So someone told me DK Metcalf had like 35-inch arms. Well, Danny told me he had 35-inch arms, and I didn't really care. And so I just tried to put it in terms that I could understand.
No. For a brief moment, you were speaking like the snowman in Frozen, and we're actually just saying that I bet he gives really big hugs. Like it humanized you for just a moment before you probably went back and tweeted something terrible about Chad Greenway.
All right, you caught me. I have feelings.
Aw. You have a feeling. One. Singular. So we're back this week. We've got some Combine stuff to talk about, along with a couple of little pieces of Vikings news as well. Mike Zimmer has been extended. There's been a couple of little moves. Trey Waynes is apparently on the chopping block, or at least on the trading block. So we got lots of things to talk about. But before we do, just want to thank you guys so much for listening and for helping out financially or otherwise over the last couple of years. We really do appreciate it. If you would like to donate to the show, if you hear value in what we put out every other week during the off season, you can go to patreon.com/Norse Code, or you can go to paypal.me/Norse Code and just give a quick donation. Tree Fitty to help keep Loch Ness Monster at bay. $1, whatever you'd like to do to help out. It just goes to the overhead, tries to make sure that we keep the show ad free and running for you. So, but if you do enjoy the show, if you hear value in what we put out, throw us a couple of bucks over at patreon.com/Norse Code or paypal.me/Norse Code. And before we start, I wanted to mention I accidentally ran into a couple of listeners at the bar on, I think it was Friday night.
Oh God, are you okay?
I am okay. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to Seth and the boys there. It was funny, and I messaged you and said I'm accidentally drinking with a couple of listeners, and I am drinking the drinks they're buying in your honor. So I mean, cheers. But the first thing they asked was, so what happened on that cab ride from New Jersey back to New York after the Jets game?
I mean, what was it? 3 hours, 6 hours? It was so long.
I aged.
Yeah,
I visibly aged.
Mostly nothing. That's the worst part is like being in a cramped space with nothing to do with a person who is like increasingly awkward.
Increasingly like showing that they should not be in the situation that they are in.
Right.
It's kind of like watching a politician who is clearly in over their head. Like, oh no, this is all going to go horribly wrong, and you're going to take 6 wrong turns on the way to the interstate, aren't you?
Yeah, but enough about James. The driver was pretty bad too.
Oh, hey. I hate you with every fiber of my being. But it was I was greatly amused by the discussion there and hanging out with them. One of them didn't actually know who I was. They just heard my voice and went, "Oh, the voice." The voice. which amused me greatly. I was like, okay, well, I mean, I'll certainly take that. At least he wasn't saying, is the guy from Jack in the Box here? Like, why?
In my head, you know, he said the voice the way those aliens in Toy Story say the claw.
Oh, yeah.
The claw.
Or it's, he thought that he wasn't entirely sure of my voice, but the very odd outfit I would have had on, was trying to hide who I was. At least I assume that's what goes. I've seen the commercials. I don't think I've actually sat down and watched the show. It's not like The Bachelor or anything where it's required watching for people who are really into NFL and draft Twitter or something. So, just
it's so weird.
Well, let's talk about Mike Zimmer for a moment. He has been extended through 2020. The Vikings had a team option for Zimmer in 2020, and they exercised it. So he will remain a Viking, hopefully, moving forward here. The biggest thing that this shows is more like stability, because there was a lot of talk about how he hadn't been extended, or how it was kind of like a question mark going into this season. So if nothing else, the Vikings seem to have, I don't know, cemented the next 2 years and saying he is our guy, right?
Yeah, so he's not performing on a lame duck contract, which coaches never like, and I think teams kind of don't like it either. So. It also means that coaches have an incentive to engage in some long-term planning. But, for the most part, it sounds like, it probably wasn't a tough decision. They just kind of waited to announce it.
And back in January, he had said something along the lines that he wasn't concerned about the lack of an extension moving forward. So it's not like this would have been a complete surprise. In fact, he was probably, like, the team might have been talking to him already about that at that point. But yeah, it is good to see, and he's easily the longest tenured coach in the NFC North.
By quite a distance.
by a great distance, now that Mike McCarthy was shot out of a cannon out of Green Bay. Where did he land, by the way? I know that he's been yelling at high school refs for basketball, but I don't know if he's landed anywhere.
I guess one would assume the Bengals because it took them forever to hire anybody, but I don't think anywhere. I don't think he's anywhere.
Wow. I had the same thought between him and John DeFilippo, and just like trying to figure out like where they were going to end up kind of going to, and neither of them were going to get a head coaching thing. They should probably both never be allowed to be head coaches at this point. But yeah, in case you haven't heard, I just want to be the person to tell you lovely people that a complaint was filed with the Wisconsin Athletic Association because Mike McCarthy proceeded to chew out a referee at a basketball game and then follow them down the hall when they left.
Well, it's good to see that he cares.
Yeah, it's the Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletic Association, the state's governing body for high school sports. And he just kept following the ref, which is weird because that wasn't his style in the NFL. It
really
either.
Wasn't.
No, He was just the, oh, bother, I got my hand and or head stuck in a big honey pot sort of like coach. Look at any video of Mike McCarthy and like try to tell me he's not like Winnie the Pooh. Like just envision him as Winnie the Pooh coaching. Like, oh,
bother.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's a combination of both Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore. It's great.
Yeah, what's amazing about the Mike McCarthy story is that there is video of him just like following a ref around. We'll put it in the show notes.
It's fantastic. Like of all things, really? Aw. I like that even after Mike McCarthy leaves, we can still just we can have a segment like every 2 or 3 months, like what's Mike McCarthy doing right now? Maybe he's Florida man, and
McCarthy update.
McCarthy watch. Be fantastic. All right, so enough about Mike Zimmer. It's great that he got the extension, and most Vikings fans would believe that this is something that is earned and deserved and everything. The big news coming out of the for the Vikings anyway, the big news coming out of the Combine is that they are shopping around Trey Waynes.
Yeah, I guess. I've seen a couple of rumors to that effect. The most credible, I think, coming from Jason La Canfora, who we have expressed some skepticism about on this show in the past. I haven't seen anything from like, Breer or Schafter or Pelissero or anything like that. Or locally, I don't think I saw anything from Gessling, who would be probably the guy that would break it locally, or Darren Wolfson or really anybody else. So I wouldn't treat this as a very strong rumor. I'd say it's, if we had a rumor scale of weak, medium, strong, this would be weak. It's in some ways it kind of makes some sense. In some ways it doesn't really make sense because, the whole reason that they drafted a cornerback in the first round last year is because of the immense amount of value that they placed on cornerback depth. And so this would really hinder that unless the Vikings were planning on grabbing another first round corner, I guess. But in other ways, it does make sense. Cornerback is probably the strongest area in the team, especially given kind of the emergence of Fulton Hill, the fact that Mackenzie Alexander played a lot better, and the fact that Mike Hughes is coming back, and I think people will expect him to play well. So, which, that's not a guarantee, which is another reason to say maybe it's not likely. But, it could be kind of somewhere in between, right? It could just be that, San Francisco called, because very often these sorts of things happen where one team calls the other, and it's reported as the other team shopping that player. So it might have been that, or it just might be kind of exploratory just to see what the value is. And if they can figure out what that value is, they can kind of make more appropriate decisions going forward. So, maybe they find out that the value is a second round pick and they're not that interested, right? But that doesn't mean they're shopping, right? So it could be any number of things that could be interpreted in a couple of different ways, but it doesn't feel like something that is imminent. Depending on the price, I might be happy to be wrong. I think it would be kind of smart because I'm not confident that the Vikings will extend him long term, which is not to say that he hasn't played at a level that deserves that extension over the past year and a half, or season and a half, I should say. But, given the cornerback situation, with Holton Hill and Mike Hughes and all that, it might just be smarter to let him walk, grab a compensatory third-round pick, and if you sign fewer free agents than you let go, and then and kind of just load up for the following year. And if you could trade him for a second-round pick now as opposed to a compensatory third 2 years later, and you only sacrifice 1 year of play, then yeah, that might be the smartest thing to do. So I wouldn't hate it, but if they trade him for like a third, that might not be worth giving up that year of play just to move 2 years early on the pick. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to think of this one, but I don't think it's a rumor that I treat with kind of a lot of credibility at the moment. But it sparked a conversation about what his trade value is, and for me, I'm pretty comfortable with that being a second round pick.
I mean, what exactly do the Vikings lose if they end up trading him? And, we end up with less depth at corner, which is something that we definitely don't want. We saw what happens to that at the end of the last season. And especially with Mike Hughes being the question mark coming back from an ACL, corners and ACLs, that's a huge question mark. And he is quite useful. I don't know if he's as useful in the passing game necessarily, but he's quite useful as a tackling corner in the run game.
He's an extraordinary run defender.
He's fantastic at it, and that's not something you just pick up off the street. Like I don't want to say it's a rarity, but it's just something you don't see very often in it
it's uncommon for sure. Yeah. Especially given the Vikings have done so well stuffing run up the middle that they kind of force passes to the outside. It's a little bit more important to have cornerbacks who can tackle for the Vikings than for other teams. It's one of the reasons the Patriots did, fairly well against the outside zone in the Super Bowl is that they were able to get their edge defenders and their cornerbacks to tackle in the run game and force the run inside. So, there are obviously applications for it despite, these arguments about how important the run game is. And, as a coverage defender, he's gotten a lot better. I think someone said that he was a better defender against the pass this year than Xavier Rhodes. I don't know if I agree with that, but one could say that he's more valuable given that he was healthy. There is, those are all the elements. And, another aspect of that might be that I know some people were saying don't trade Waynes, trade Rhodes because he's fallen off over the last year and a half, the exact same period of time that Waynes has really improved pretty dramatically. Plus, he's a little bit older. Plus, he's shown that proclivity for injury that we saw really early in his career. So it would make more sense to trade Rhodes away, and his contract is a little bit more costly for the Vikings and so on. So, yeah, I don't know. It is interesting because you say, hey, it might be smarter for the Vikings to trade Rhodes, but then you think about this team and you think it's very unlikely that they would trade Rhodes. And so if it is better to trade Rhodes and it just feels like something they wouldn't do, then it also probably seems likely that they wouldn't trade Waynes. And you're right, that depth has been, I think, hammered home for the Vikings a lot. They had Sherrills taking significant snaps this year. And again, he did all right. So, people got to chill out about how good of a corner he is. But you never want to be in that situation where you've got your fifth or sixth cornerback continuing to take snaps.
No, and he has the durability compared to Rhodes, but he also has that ability to get that pass interference play at the absolute worst possible time. Like, it seems to me that any time that a team wanted to try to get a quick PI, they were always targeting Waynes.
Yeah, and I think it's also notable that Waynes just soaks up so many more targets, even when he's been playing well, soaks up so many more targets than Rhodes does, despite the fact that Rhodes tends to play the number one receiver. That's interesting, right? That probably tells us a lot about how other teams kind of view those two cornerbacks, that even in a year where it feels like Rhodes has done worse, that they just much rather target Waynes. You could say, hey, teams are inefficient and they don't respond to new information very well, and that might be the case. But teams tend to prefer their matchups over the matchups that are presented to them, which is to say that they would prefer to throw to the wide receiver over the top cornerback unless the read on the field indicates kind of otherwise. And that's not always the case. I think people remember the game where the Seahawks and the Packers played 10-on-10 because they just put like their fourth string receiver on Richard Sherman. But for the most part, that seems to be the case. So, I don't know. These are conversations I didn't really think I'd be having 2 years ago. So that's probably a good indication of how much further Waynes has come. But yeah, no, I would say that it's fairly unlikely. But if it were to happen, I wouldn't be opposed to it, probably depending on the price.
Yeah. The other thing that's kind of questionable is the fate of Everson Griffin. And not necessarily that teams have been talking to the Vikings about him, but just the question of whether or not this is somebody that should be on the chopping block or should be traded.
Yeah, there's another rumor about Everson Griffin being traded. I'm not even going to really put any credit. I wouldn't even call it weak credibility. I'm not going to link it in the show notes.
We're not going to. It doesn't warrant the promotion. But is this the potential? It feels like the only team asking the Vikings about being a possible trade partner is San Francisco. Is this the potential San Francisco thought?
No, I mean that would be potentially the rumor, but no, I wouldn't really justify talking about that rumor. Instead, it's important to bring up, at the Combine, Mike Zimmer said that they were absolutely not going to cut Everson Griffin, which I found kind of interesting because I think Gessling reported that kind of despite those conversations, or despite what he said, that there are still discussions about restructuring Everson Griffin. And the only way you can approach a restructure conversation is if you've got some credibility to say, if you don't agree, we'll probably cut you. And so if you don't have the credibility to say that, and if you say something like, we're absolutely not going to cut him, then it sounds like you're not going to be able to restructure. So I don't know. But there's Mike Zimmer saying they're not going to cut him. There's Ben Gessling saying they're going to restructure him. Those two statements are not at odds with each other in any way. They're not mutually exclusive, but it would be odd to make one statement if the other one was true. So that's kind of interesting. Obviously, for the team, it's good to have players on as cheap a contract as possible. So obviously, for the team, it would be good if they restructured Everson. But I would say that this would be like a medium level rumor, right? That things don't quite add up, but it's reported by a pretty credible source, and it's something to kind of watch. Plus, it makes a ton of sense for the Vikings, and might make more sense than say the Waynes trade. If they can, get Griffin to agree. So that would be kind of curious. Obviously, Griffin's a little bit older. I think he's entering the season at age 32. He had a down year, in some ways pretty understandable. It took him, I think, 2 games after he came back for him to really get in the swing of things. And he honestly, after he got into the swing of things, wasn't even consistent about that. He had some good games and some bad games. So obviously he started off the year really well. But that year is hard to evaluate, and we'll kind of see kind of going forward what that means for him. He's a much older player than the number of starts he's played would suggest, because he was backing up Jared Allen and Brian Robinson / Ray Edwards for so long. There's a name, Ray Edwards. So we'll see if the Vikings kind of think that the number of snaps he's played or the number of years he's old kind of matter more in terms of his long-term value. But I would expect a restructure, even though Zimmer said that. We'll see.
Yeah, between the two of them, I'm not entirely sure which one would be better to let go. If there was just a question of like cap space or anything, and Wayne's deal isn't really costing us anything, so it just becomes. And Everson Griffin, despite the issues that he had this season, is a locker room leader. He's been around. He's been there for a very long time. I mean, you mentioned Ray Edwards as somebody he backed up. Ray Edwards hasn't played with the team in a decade?
Right, yeah. Everson's been around.
Yeah, he's been a Viking for quite some time. So it's worth thinking about, if nothing else. CJ Ham and Matt Wile both will be playing with the Vikings next year, it looks like. We get our Ham back. That's a positive. Yeah,
they're both exclusive rights free agents, so it only costs $600,000 in cash, virtually nothing in cap. Because of the top 51 rule, obviously once the season starts, the cap gets recalculated. And so they'll count then. But either way, good stuff. I would still open Matt Wile up to a punting competition, but, I thought that for the most part he was fine. 3 really good games, 1 pretty bad game, 3 really good games, 1 pretty bad game. It sounded like that's what we were going to get from him. And he was fairly consistent about that kind of inconsistency throughout the season. His upside is really good, and his really excellent games have been really excellent. So I'd be happy about that, but I'd still be open to a punting competition with him. CJ Ham is like an above average fullback. That's good to see. He's not stellar, like as a blocking back. He's no Kleinsasser or more contemporarily, the Chiefs' Anthony Sherman. He's not as versatile as like Kyle Juszczyk or anything like that, but he's an above average fullback. And so getting him at literally the lowest possible price, fine.
And if you have your CJ Ham jerseys, you can still wear them for another year without shame.
Hooray!
That was my favorite thing I saw at the tailgate for the Jets game. Was just the tallest, biggest guy I've saw there was just rocking the CJ Ham jersey. It was poetry.
That's amazing.
I wanted one for myself at that particular moment, because it was just so cool to see. It's like, you know what? That's a pretty ancillary character. Sure, why not? That'll be fun. So, Combine. Arif, you spent several days over in Indianapolis, as we covered, and you were out there talking about the Combine. I believe you yourself got measured, and I asked about the Wonderlic, and you said you hadn't had a chance yet. Did you end up having a chance to take the Wonderlic while you were out there? Did anyone ask you any incredibly off-putting questions?
Well, for the second one, I won't comment. But for the first,
anyone touch your chest and be like, "You got a soft breastplate there, buddy"?
Only after I shared the story about how that happened in Nate Davis, and then a couple of people walked up to me and did that. So,
well, see, that's why you never tell that story.
Yeah, good joke, everybody. Real original. But yeah, okay. So context. Nate Davis, guard for UNC Charlotte. Was asked, hey, what's the weirdest question you've been asked? And he says, well, this isn't a question, but probably the weirdest thing that happened to me at the Combine is I go in for an interview and I go to shake, the guy's hand, hey, how you doing? And instead of shaking my hand, he punches me in the chest and says, you have a soft chest. And I'm like, okay.
I want that to be Gruden so badly it hurts.
Right. Well, so Charles McDonald, Chuck, responded in the Twitter replies when I tweeted that out that Dan Quinn did the same thing to him. So, and Atlanta needs a guard. So, maybe a lot of people said it was Gruden. A couple of people said it might be the Seahawks. I guess they do staring contests. So we'll talk about that in a second, too.
Please.
But yeah. A lot so most of the replies were like, this is kind of funny and silly. Some of the quote tweets were like, I can't believe this happens. The NFL goes over the line. I can't, they, elid workplace and labor law. And yeah, okay, I agree that that's all true. I would say that in this case, it's not. Like, he wasn't like assaulted, right? Like some people like went out of their minds condemning this. And like, he clearly didn't care that much. So I'd probably slow my roll on that. It's just a funny story. Some people were like, the team's looking for him to punch back, which obviously he's not going to do that. Which I guess that disqualifies him, hypothetically. I know that someone said that when they were in college that their coach did that to see if players would punch back, and he wanted them to. So I guess that's a thing. Other people have suggested that it's just like, can you stay calm in a weird situation like that, which a lot of these are. And, maybe the guy is just weird. Like, that's a possibility, too. So, yeah, that's all that happened. Also, I forget who it was. But, that guy said that, hey, what's the weirdest thing that happened to you? And he goes, yeah, I got into a staring contest. 15 to 16 seconds, I won. Which, like, okay, that happened in the interview. But the thing that, like, so that was, like, weird, I guess. But the thing that, like, really kind of blew people up was that Jim Nagy, who's now the director of the Senior Bowl, the executive director of the Senior Bowl, and in charge of, like, talent acquisition for the Senior Bowl, and a former Seahawks scout, of course, just responded with grit test, which is just so hilariously absurd.
I'm sorry. How does one test for grit?
I just told you.
Oh, the staring
you can
contest.
even quantify it by you can even quantify it now by how many seconds the player performs the grit test.
I mean, sorry. I keep envisioning the like
Grit.
Instead of grit, I'm just trying to think of the term they use for like sandpaper. And like,
no, it's grit. It's like 80 grit, 160 grit, 300 grit.
Just like that's how you're. No, that is not a thing.
You definitely measure like a player's competitiveness and toughness with a staring contest.
No, screw that. If you're gonna do that, if you're gonna check out somebody's competitiveness, just
punch him in the chest. Yeah, I agree. Totally.
I was gonna say have like Mario Kart out there or something. Like
that would be a dope team interview. Actually, I really like that idea because then you can ask all kinds of questions and throw guards down, right?
Oh, completely. Because they're it's the talking while driving thing. They'll likely be more open because they're distracted and like, oh, okay, yeah. Well, we're friends now because I didn't throw the blue shell at you, so.
Right. Yeah.
I want to hear like.
Although that would be a really good test of a person's character if, the team executive throws the blue shell at the player,
and whether or not that it gets out later. Like, I was playing Mario Kart with the Dolphins, and it all went horribly wrong. When their GM threw the blue shell, and I proceeded to throw the controller across the room, but it can't be like Nintendo Switch, or it can't be like it has to be like GameCube or like SNES or N64.
Yeah,
like it has to be one of those older ones. Like this game probably came out after you were born, or like before you were born.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. If I was a team executive, I'd find some way to set that up. And what's great is that like you're making an odd request to the convention center because they have to have the like adapter cables. I guess you bring it with you, but like you have to bring like adapter, whatever video to HDMI to make sure it works.
Yeah, these things exist. I have them at home. Yeah, I just want to like if I was a team like, okay, today we're welcome potential draftee. We're playing GoldenEye. Have you ever played GoldenEye before?
Sit down and learn something.
And no odd job. And right around the time that they get their first headshot, you just smack them in the chest. Oh, you got a soft chest there, bud.
How do they react to like dying from slaps? That's the best part.
There's proxy mines everywhere. What have you done? So, it's kind of hard to tackle a topic like the combine just straight out. So, I suppose what I should start off with is, what was the biggest surprise while you were there? Like, is this the first time you've actually gone to the combine?
Yeah, it's my first combine.
Yeah.
I guess I was a little surprised at the fact that everything was in a convention center. So the combine tests were at Lucas Oil Stadium, but we didn't have a field pass, which fine. But it is like a distinctly odd feeling to like watch the combine on the same television feed as everyone else in the country, but you're like a minute from it, like a minute away. And so
that's kind of like the people who watch the Cowboys game at the stadium outside.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot like that. I would say that in defense of those people is that they're at least surrounded by Cowboys fans. It's not really the same thing to be surrounded by like beat writers.
There's not that level of camaraderie.
Yeah.
There's significantly less tailgating, probably more drinking.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Precisely. So it was like weird. The convention center area that they had us in for the media workspace, the ballroom, was enormous. It was like cavernous, and really quiet. It was like disturbingly quiet. I was like, I can't work in here. And the fluorescent hum was like very loud, which turned me into an asshole because I just kept telling other people about it, even though I knew they couldn't hear it until I said anything. And then they couldn't stop thinking about it.
You are that guy. Congratulations on becoming that guy.
Awful person. Like,
were you telling people to get off your lawn by the end of it too?
Hey, did you hear that hum? What hum? From the fluorescent. Oh my God.
Now it's all they could hear about. Now it's all they could hear. And, Indianapolis has like 3 like pending murders now based upon like Danny Kelly and others.
Yeah, right. Derek Klassen, I think, got the worst of it because at QB Klass, because I reminded him every single day.
Wow, so you've moved on from trying to get into fights on Twitter and trying to get into fights with beat writers in real life because they can't really block you in real life.
Yeah, it's the next level of cyberbullying, real life bullying.
Be better, Arif. Be better.
But I was a little surprised just in general, kind of how quiet and enormous that workspace was. And how you actually couldn't see many TVs from a lot of spaces inside that ballroom. And so you had to like walk up to the TV to watch it. So I actually got more updates about the combine while at the combine from Twitter, from people who were watching television. Like I learned a lot more about what was happening in the tests from Twitter, despite being 500 feet from the combine.
That's a really odd way to live. That's
it was like bizarre. So that was maybe the most surprising. And it's not like I'm complaining about any of that. I was just like confused. But I mean, like the access to the players is great. The ability to talk to all those beat writers is pretty fantastic. And then like going out and drinking afterwards was pretty fun. Got to talk to like some random like team officials and all that. Jerry Jones and the Dallas Cowboys rented out the top of one of the bars just because it's like a 2-level, and they just stayed there like all night, probably past official bar close. Just kept ordering Johnny Walker Blue.
Hard-hitting reporting from Norse Code.
Yeah. Don't investigate that, Indianapolis city officials.
Patreon.me/ basically.
But yeah, no, it was a ton of fun. I talked to all kinds of people, like people that you wouldn't think would be at the combine, but actually are, right? Like, I had a quick chat with someone who works for Madden, right? I talked to like offensive line specialists that aren't even with the team. I talked to like former coaches. Yeah, like just people that like, oh, it makes sense that you're here. But like, if I were to like create a list of all the people that, I would go to the combine to see, that's not really likely to be on my list. So, I talked to like Sage Rosenfels and stuff like that. People I expected, like beat writers and stuff. But then, every so often you're like, oh yeah, of course it makes sense for you to be here. But yeah, no, it was a ton of fun.
So what was it like when the height of Kyler Murray was revealed? Was that just like was that a bit just like the spoiler of the weekend, or was everyone just like why was everyone just exchanging money at that point? Like, I had the under.
Yeah, I was not actually at the convention center when that happened, so I was like feverishly checking Twitter. So I can't tell you what everybody else was doing. In my head, they're all glued to the random TVs around the convention center. But mostly it was just reported on Twitter anyway. So like my experience is basically the same as everyone else's because I was getting breakfast. So I can't even like tell you like what it was like.
What is
I was
the
just
Athletic paying you for?
Breakfast.
Clearly. Was it good? Did it have a height?
I mean, it was a free breakfast, but for a free breakfast, it was pretty good.
Did it have a height above to 5'10"? Like,
it exceeded expectations, so yes.
Would you refer to it as, Drew Brees-esque, or was it a little more like run of the mill, or was it more like Josh Rosen?
It was definitely in between those two enormous extremes.
Fine.
Okay, well, I'll say this. So very shortly after that, I made it to the convention center, and I talked to a lot of people about it, and everyone was like fairly unimpressed.
Well, for some reason, it was the story of the week.
Well, right. So I mean, the height, it was fairly significant because 5'8" might be undraftable, but 5'10", we've already drafted that. So that was important, but I think by then a lot of people knew he was going to measure at 5'10". I guess I wasn't one of them. But like a lot of people had known. The real big question was about his weight. And so, I thought based off of what I was seeing that he played around 185. And his official weight at Oklahoma was 194. People might put on weight if it's convenient for them to get up to 204. And so I think a lot of people might have expected him to be around 205, and he measured in at 207, which, a lot of people called a big win. But if I'm right that he was playing at 185 and he put on 20 extra pounds, it's really significant that he didn't do any workouts, because that would tell us if it's bad weight or good weight. If it's good weight, and if it's weight that he might be able to sustain, he would be able to perform all of his drills. If it was his playing weight, he'd be able to perform all of his drills. And if not, it makes sense that he wouldn't perform any of the drills. So if he does those drills at his pro day and weighs in at his pro day at 190, that'll tell us, I think, a lot more. A lot of people pointed out that Russell Wilson, a similar height, weighed in at 204 or something like that at the combine. And so Murray weighs more than Wilson weighed at the combine. And so we shouldn't be concerned about his size, which I think is kind of ridiculous because Wilson lost weight in order to perform his drills better, and then got back up to his playing weight, which in the NFL has largely been 225. I believe last season it was 215. And so, he's built like a running back, whereas Murray's kind of the opposite, where he gained weight so that he can meet a weight requirement, and then he didn't work out and indicate that he could play at that level. So, or by at that level, I mean at that weight. So, yeah, that was the more important discussion, and I think a lot of people that I was talking to kind of just generally agreed that weight marker is kind of insignificant if he's not going to do football stuff in that weight, because the question is not, can he find a way to weigh 207 pounds? The question is, can he play at 207 pounds? And I'm of the opinion that he can't, and that you have to accept that he's going to be 190 whatever in the NFL. And you have to figure out if that's something you're comfortable with, which is fine. Some people are. I'm a little less comfortable with it. But yeah, I mean, the height thing I think is a lot less important for people than the weight thing, and for me, it's pretty unimportant.
So let's talk about offensive linemen, because it had been mentioned that the Vikings met with all manner of offensive linemen.
Yeah, apparently like all of them.
I know, right? Did we learn anything important about the offensive line class this year?
Yeah, in fact, I actually just published a piece at The Athletic about, which members of the offensive line group kind of fit the Vikings workout or profile. So notably, Greg Little, who was very occasionally mocked to the Vikings, missed out on the athletic test that the Vikings tend to use. He ran an extraordinarily slow 3-cone, and in the player position drills, looked pretty duck-footed and unable to move. And for a guy whose thing is his upside, that's pretty concerning. Cody Ford missed out. He's been mocked to the Vikings a ton. And more recently, he's been going even sooner than the Vikings have the ability to even pick him. And the interesting thing about him, of course, is that he can play both guard and tackle in theory, or at least he's being treated that way by the draft. And so, if the Vikings drafted him, he might play guard for a year and then kick out to tackle when Riley Reif's contract makes it easier to cut him or something like that. He also did not meet the Vikings qualifications, thresholds, or whatever you want to say it, by a fairly significant margin. So that's interesting. And then Jonah Williams also missed, but I think that's kind of unimportant for two reasons. The first is that Williams missed the mark at guard by 0.01 seconds. And the second is that these don't move players completely off a board. All these thresholds do is adjust the value for that player. And as a result, the Vikings would value that player less than other teams. Now, if all teams had the same process and for some reason Jonah Williams fell, I wouldn't say that the Vikings wouldn't draft him, because he's probably the top tackle in this class. So, hey, he doesn't meet a workout. We've graded him a little lower. He fell to us at 18. Our grade still has him above, 18th overall pick. So I'm not saying that they wouldn't draft Williams, Ford, or Little. I'm just saying that because they don't meet the thresholds, the Vikings have a lower value on them than otherwise, and that other teams who likely don't have the same athletic thresholds would value those guys more and are more likely to move up to draft them. So the Williams one is kind of interesting. Also, Dalton Risner, who a ton of Vikings fans have been talking about and have been excited about grabbing, who had a really good Senior Bowl. He met the Vikings qualifications at interior offensive line, but he did not meet them at tackle. But the amount that he didn't meet at tackle was very, very small amount. So that's just kind of interesting. It's important to note that a player like Garrett Bradbury, killed it at the combine, and he's somebody that might interest the Vikings, kind of depending on how they feel about Pat Elflein at center or Garrett Bradbury at guard. Then also we're missing, I think, Chris Lindstrom, who I don't think performed all the workouts. So that's, kind of one thing that we learned from the combine. Andre Dillard, the Washington State offensive tackle, he's super interesting. So he destroyed the drills as a tackle, but he doesn't have a ton of experience run blocking. He was in an offense that probably passed it 750 times and ran it maybe 200 times, just kind of like the inverse of what you'd expect in college. And so, he's a guy that has a lot of question marks about whether or not he can run block. He did it decently well at the Senior Bowl, and he always seems to have his feet under him, which is great. But the Vikings tend to emphasize the run. So we'll kind of see. He's the guy that I'm most curious about how the combine will affect his draft stock, because, you see him kind of bounce around the first through third rounds. Now a bunch of people have put him in the first round as kind of a first-round lock. Like I've seen a couple of lists of 20 to 23 players where they're first-round locks, and he tends to be on those lists. So we'll see, if he's done enough. I talked to a couple of offensive line people about what they use the combine for. And obviously in terms of the athletic drills, he blew them out of the water. But in terms of the on-field drills, some of those offensive line specialists, they'll pay a lot of attention to the pass protection stuff. but they don't think that the run blocking stuff is actually all that useful in terms of what you see at the combine, in terms of the positional drills, which that makes it all the more fascinating, kind of what's going to happen with Andre Dillard.
So I suppose the next question is, did the Vikings end up meeting with any other position groups?
Yeah, I saw that the Vikings met with Noah Fant, I believe, although I'm not going to say that I'm reporting it, so if you don't see it anywhere else, don't take it from me. But I believe they also met with TJ Hawkinson, the two Iowa tight ends that occasionally get mocked to the Vikings, especially Noah Fant. But, I saw that, they might have met with a defensive back or two. I saw that they met with a couple of linebackers. All of that makes sense. They only have 60 visits, official visits, and they spent a significant number of them apparently in offensive linemen, but there aren't even 60 offensive linemen. So they definitely met with members of other position groups. But I didn't track those as aggressively. I'm sure you can find them. WalterFootball.com tends to have a ton of them. I don't love that website for a lot of reasons, but they do that tracker really well.
So let's wrap up the combine stuff with a quick question about kickers. Why kickers? So in an interview, why kickers indeed? As anybody, one of the people that I was out drinking with actually lost the Norse Code League number 2. He had made it to the finals. He was actually in the league. So
wow!
He apparently wasn't paying attention during any of the times I had mentioned the whole -25 rule. So after game 1, he's like, "What is going on here?"
It's definitely the defining feature of the league.
That is this car has no doors on it. I'm sorry, where are the doors on the car? I'm confused. Where all other cars have doors. I'm confused as to the main leading part of this whole deal. Anyway, Zimmer has been quoted saying that he's looking into the potential of having a kicking specialist on board. Is this going to be another one of the former coaches coming on board and being like, all right, so we have another former head coach and we're going to put him in charge of kicking?
No, I think if they do it,
he's the kicking version of Kubiak.
Right. I think if they do it, it wouldn't be a guy who also has head coach experience. I think it would be a guy who focuses exclusively on kickers, especially because apparently if they do decide to bring a kicking specialist on, that kicking specialist won't be involved in the acquisition of a kicker. So it happened fairly late in the process, after the draft. I guess that also kind of means that maybe Dan Bailey's up in the air. I mean, he's a free agent, but that means they might not actually pursue Dan Bailey, which would make me a little sad. But yeah, I guess they want a kicking coach. So I saw a bunch of people respond to this with, well, what's the point of having a special teams coordinator anyway? And a couple of things. The first is that this is how kind of it's always been. Special teams coordinators don't very often get involved in the mechanics of kicking and punting and coaching them really precisely and directly. Very often, kicking and punting coaching is something that players pursue in the off season, or they'll teach each other, when they meet in camp and stuff, if they're in a competition. This happens a lot. So it's actually not that shocking that a special teams coordinator wouldn't actually be all involved in the direct technical coaching of the special team, whoever, right, of the specialist. It's a little similar to how a defensive coordinator will design what the defense does, but will leave up all of the individual technical coaching to a linebackers coach. But as you notice, there's no position coaches in special teams. So yeah, it's not that shocking that, they would essentially say, hey, Marwan Malouf is not going to be involved in the technical side of it, because that very rarely happens. Instead, special teams coordinators are very much involved in the actual punt return, kick return type stuff. And so they get very involved in setting up schematically what that looks like, responding to fakes, creating fakes, designing and scouting, those formations and stuff like that. And so they'll be involved in the technical side of blocking and tackling, especially for offensive players. but they will not be very involved in the specialist coaching technique. So yeah, that's not a huge shock. I think a lot of people have an understanding of what the special team coordinator does that's not quite mapped to what they actually do.
So, honest question, is there a limit to the number of specialists that a NFL coach or an NFL coaching staff can have?
I don't think so.
It just it seems like there's a lot of potential specialists that would be kind of on board for the the Vikings.
I think coaching staffs have increased in size over the years, so we haven't hit a limit. And if we would have done so a couple years ago when coaching staffs were slightly smaller. But I mean, like the Chiefs had like 26 coaches on their roster this year, and the Vikings have less than that. So.
The Brad Childress role is the only thing I think of when I hear of like an offensive specialist. Like I just think of Brad Childress just scribbling down notes, hanging out in the balconies of Arrowhead Stadium.
Right.
Anything else you want to mention about the combine before we end up moving out to the mailbag?
Not really. I mean, I guess I do want to add, like, this is a little off topic because it's not like reporting or opinions. But for me, like, it's a huge milestone to be able to go to the combine. And so I'm like super proud of the fact that I was able to do that. A ton of people listening to this will not have listened to like the first couple episodes of the show, which, by the way, don't do that.
Yeah, let's try to stay topical. Let's try to stick to sports and do it early.
Yeah, but it's been like kind of an incredible journey being a person who talks about sports for a living, where I was scrambling to get a couple of days of access to training camp, and I needed to like crowdfund my ability to go there. To all the way to here, where I've like got this full-time salary, I can go to basically any NFL event that I want to, from a credential. And then people respect my work a lot, and then a ton of people follow me. And, I've grown from like literally obviously 0 followers to 20 followers to now like 25,000 on Twitter, plus even more people who read my work that don't even follow me on Twitter. So the combine is just this incredible milestone because it's it's a difficult event to get credentialed for. And people get their credentials turned away from the combine all the time, even though they've got very legitimate reasons to be there. So I'm just super proud of everything that's kind of happened to get me up to this point, but also super grateful because it's not something I'd have been able to do without people constantly like listening and reading my work. So kind of unprompted, but like huge thanks to you guys for kind of supporting me to get there, because it has been super unlikely for me to be able to do that coming all the way up from being a blogger. Like we had a summit, actually. The Athletic had like a whole meeting where we spent the first half of an entire day talking to like other members of the Athletic and talking about whose stories were successful and why and stuff like that. And a bunch of people, we were trading basically backgrounds. We were saying, hey, what did you do before the Athletic and stuff like that? And so many of those people were either like with teams or like with ESPN, CBS Sports, or the local newspaper like NJ.com, Dallas Morning News, stuff like that. And they'd ask me, and I'd be like, oh, I wrote for, a website called zonecoverage.com. Before that, I did some blogging. It's just such an unusual, and I feel like I'm the only one there besides Ted Wynn, who I spent a lot of time with, who does national stuff for The Athletic. I feel like we're the only two people there that have that background, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without the extraordinary amount of support that I get from like the people who listen to this podcast and the people who read my work. So just a huge thank you.
Do you still feel like you have imposter syndrome when talking to some of the
people? Always. Are you kidding me? Yeah, what am I even doing here, man?
What am I doing here? Before we go to the mailbag, quick shout out to an awesome guest that we had last fall. Tampa Bay Trey asked the best question of the combine, in my personal opinion.
This is good.
When you know him better. I'll let you handle this because it's so goddamn funny.
So I assume we're talking about the same thing. So he initially sent out a tweet at the Kyler Murray presser.
Yes.
Saying if this gets 1,000 retweets, I'll ask this question. And he says, what the question is in the tweet. And like, it got like 500 retweets before he was like, screw it, I love you guys, I'm going to do it. So he walks up to, so there's a lull in the conversation. Remember, this is like millions and millions of people are watching, right? It's the Kyler Murray presser, probably the most watched presser out of all of them. And he asks a question that is a normal question to ask, I think, for most people.
That haven't, recently said that they were going to choose between their professions.
Right. And something that that the Twin Cities media even asked Mike Zimmer, right? And he asks, if you weren't playing professional football, what would you be doing right now? Oh, my God.
Well, it's not like I just turned down the Oakland Athletics or anything. Right.
And Murray, the hilarious part is that Murray handled it very poorly. Sorry, what was the question? If I wasn't going to be doing anything if I wasn't doing football, what would I be doing right now?
Oh no, maybe this knocked him down a draft board.
You can't ask that.
We can't. No, he can't handle this. I bet he's going to do the Jamarcus Russell thing and come back with a blank DVD saying, "Yep, I looked at all the plays, coach."
I love the offense. Yeah, he said you can't ask that. What? Come on, man. Which, there's a rumor, not a rumor. Charlie Cashley reported that a number of teams told him, and Charlie Cashley works for NFL.com. He used to be a general manager, I believe, for the Texans. And he said, there's tons of interviews, right, where Kyler Murray knocked himself down team boards because they had questions about his leadership and his commitment and all that. And honestly, if you've seen the clip of him talking to Dan Patrick on the Dan Patrick Show, I don't know if you've seen this, James. It's one of the most awkward experiences of your life. This is a couple of months ago. And
was it more or less awkward than the Kirk Cousins conversation with Dan Patrick, where he said he couldn't sleep well at night? But then Dan Patrick reminded him, well, but you're on these sleep number beds, so that's got to help.
That was hilarious. And Kirk at least handled it like a human or a socially capable robot.
Yes. Oddly enough, these two things were right at the top of his draft board.
Right. Murray didn't handle it very well. So, Dan Patrick asks basically the same question, except directly, right? As opposed to this feigned ignorance about a baseball career. And it was, what are you going to choose between, football or baseball? The question, he has to have on lock as he's doing these media tours, right? That his agent must have prepped him for. And he just doesn't
It would
answer.
Be dumb if he didn't have any sort of idea that it was coming.
Exactly, right? And I imagine his agent actually did prep him for it, but he got inside himself. He kind of curled up a little bit. I don't know if he physically curled up, but watching and listening, it felt like he got physically smaller and he was shying away from answering any questions. It sounded like he didn't string 3 words together. And so this was kind of an extension of that. And I wouldn't be surprised if his failure in team interviews, if those in fact happened, his failure in team interviews is just because he's extraordinarily introverted and not initially charismatic, which is not to say that he's not charismatic. But there's a difference between being charismatic among people that you're comfortable with, say your locker room teammates, and being charismatic with people you've just met who are trying to evaluate you.
Becoming Ryan Leaf, the Kyler Murray story.
It's kind of the opposite. He's kind of a bigger asshole to people he knew. But yeah. So there's this question about whether or not, he has what it takes to be a quarterback from a personality perspective, which I don't know, maybe. Teams play so much in these interviews that I can't see how it matters. Okay, if the guy's got a character problem and you want him to talk about it, and if he can't talk about it, that's probably legitimately a flag. But if he's not charismatic to you upon 5 minutes of you meeting him, does that really translate into, not being able to lead a team as a quarterback, as the season starts? I don't know. It's probably, maybe it does, but I bet there's more important information that leads to the same question out there, what do his Oklahoma teammates think of him? And more importantly, because the teammates may be lying to help their friend, which they wouldn't do if they don't like him. But, maybe they're lying. You could ask a bunch of coaches that are actually much more likely to tell the truth because they have an incentive to tell the truth, because if they want to go to bat for a prospect, they want the NFL to believe them. So you're more likely to get real stuff out of that. But I guess he bombed interviews, and Tampa Bay Trey might have explained or might have revealed further why.
If you're not following him on Twitter, you're doing yourself a disservice. Twitter exists
for viral tweets. He's good at those.
Yeah, Twitter exists almost exclusively for people like him, especially during halftimes when he just opens up and asks, hey, anybody have any questions, football or not? He will answer the question, what color is a mirror? He will go in depth on that for you. Let's go to the mailbag. Marco asks, how do the combine athletic profiles the Vikings tend to draft factor into this year's draft options at tight end, defensive tackle, and offensive tackle?
Well, so at tight end, no surprise that Noah Fant fits all of the athletic. I mean, he killed every test. As Justice Mosqueda points out, he tested like Danielle Hunter, but at tight end. So there were not that many tight ends invited to the combine in the first place, and not a ton of tight ends who did every test. So it sounds like a small number, but 5 tight ends from the combine met, and a couple more didn't do the workout. So, and again, I'm not going to give this all away because this isn't an article I wrote for The Athletic. But real quick, Hawkinson and Fant, obviously, Dawson Knox, Drew Sample, and Foster Moreau are the 5 tight ends that fit. A couple more big names like Irv Smith, who had a really bad combine, didn't meet the requirements at tight end, and a couple more did not do all the workouts. Also pretty close to those cutoffs were Cahill Waring from San Diego State and Josh Oliver from San Jose State. Offensive tackle, I just talked about a bunch of them. So you'll be able to see that over at The Athletic. What were the other ones? Defensive tackle, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm writing this piece right now, but I do have all the numbers available. Here we go. Yeah, so defensive tackle, obviously Quinnen Williams, not a huge surprise, fit. Rashawn Gary, if he plays defensive tackle, fit. Jerry Tillery from Notre Dame fits. Kalen Saunders from I think a Division II school, Western Illinois, and Renell Wren from Arizona State fits. Christian Wilkins, who's a nose tackle, fits. And then you've got some questions, right? Because we don't have full complete data for Ed Oliver, who only did the bench press and the vertical jump and the explosion test, but not the agility tests. That's important for the Vikings profile for players that size. And then Dexter Lawrence didn't do the explosion workouts, even though that's and I believe he got injured and that's what prevented it from happening. But that's what's important for a player of his size. He's 342 pounds. So I would imagine that Lawrence would fit, and I would imagine that Ed Oliver would fit. But yeah. The biggest name to not meet the Vikings workout thresholds at defensive tackle is Draymond Jones from Ohio State, who had just an all-around just this awful combine. At defensive end, it's actually I'm doing some additional research on this, but everybody met the athletic thresholds, and so just absurdly everybody all 22 people who were, one person didn't. Who's going to end up being an undrafted free agent anyway? What's his name? Or maybe not an undrafted free agent, but Christian Miller from Alabama is the only one who didn't meet them. I would suspect that CeCe Jefferson doesn't, but based off of the tests I was doing, he did. So I'm kind of reworking that test and seeing if there's a different, more exclusive threshold that the Vikings use, manipulating the numbers in a different way and seeing if that can kind of narrow down any of these defensive ends. Because so only 50% of pass rushers over the past 10 years met this threshold. And then almost everybody at this, and this is an absurdly great combine for defenders, just physical specimens everywhere, just incredible athletes. And so I'm not hugely shocked that you got more than normal, but literally everybody is a very difficult thing to transmit, but a ton of people met. So yeah, I'm going to be reworking that and seeing if there's more exclusive set of thresholds the Vikings might be using in this situation.
All right, next question is from Hunter, who says, pre-combine, it seemed like Devin White was the only Barr replacement in the draft. Now, with several linebackers testing similarly, are there any prospects that could potentially replace Barr?
That's really tough, just because Barr is a unicorn. But you're looking for essentially people 230 to 250 pounds that ran a shockingly fast 40, that have a really good 3-cone, that had good jumps. So those are people like Brian Burns from Florida State, 249 pounds, ran a 4.53 40, which is, I believe, faster than Barr's 40 at the combine. Barr himself at the pro day ran a 4.44 at 255 pounds. That's difficult to track, but Montez Sweat did hit that number and a bunch of other really great numbers at 260 pounds. He's a guy I would probably keep on the edge, but he's a guy that kind of fits all of that with that amount of crazy speed. Other than that, I mean, you're asking for a lot. Maybe Justin Hollins from Oregon. He weighs 248 pounds, did a 4.5 40, didn't do a 3-cone, but a pretty fast, short shuttle, decent jumps and stuff like that. Sutton Smith, probably not even. I mean, he's 233 pounds, but he ran a 4.7 40. And we're looking for people kind of in the 4.5 range. Barr's a unicorn. It's tough to find that athletic profile. Basically maybe just those 3 names, and one of them is a guy that Montez Sweat that you're probably just going to keep on the edge. Also, if we want to talk about actual linebackers and not just edge rushers like Barr was coming at, both the Devons did really well. Devin Bush doesn't have quite Barr's height, which is kind of one of the things that makes him stand out. And Devin White is only an inch taller, but both of them just absolutely dominated the combine. They were within an inch of each other in the vertical jump, 40.5, 39.5. And in the broad jump, Devin Bush got a little bit further at 10'4", which is pretty incredible, on a 6.93 3-cone, both measuring in a little bit better than Devin White at LSU. But again, both of them absolutely crushed it. Devin White did it, I think, 3 pounds heavier. Very, very, very similar combines, with Bush having a bit of an advantage in a lot of areas except for height and length. So both of those guys might meet the athletic thresholds. Obviously, Bush more than White. But a guy to keep an eye on might be Blake Cashman, the University of Minnesota grad. Turned a ton of heads, ran a 4.5 40, a 37.5-inch vert, 10.4 broad jump, just like Devin Bush, and better short shuttle and almost identical 3-cone. And he is taller and just slightly heavier than Devin Bush. So he might be kind of the mid-round guy. And then Gary Johnson, not that one, but a linebacker from Texas, also was one of 3, one could even say a third party, to run faster than a 4.45 at linebacker. And his jumps aren't nearly as good or anything like that. He didn't kill the rest of the tests like the Devons did, but he did all right.
You should be ashamed of yourself. Kyle Slaby says, which combine participant surprised you the most with their testing, good or bad?
Well, I guess I was surprised that Ja'Kai Polite, didn't do anything. Well, so, he ran a slow 40 and then afterwards claimed he had injured a hamstring. Maybe that's the case, I have some suspicion. But, yeah, that was kind of surprising. He's supposed to be this physical freak, and he didn't do it. So that, I guess, would be kind of like a negative surprise. Blake Cashman surprised me in terms of how positively he tested. I saw a Cowboys fan scouting him. The Cowboys don't need a linebacker, but they saw these numbers and they had to look. I think it was Jonah Tulse. He said he's getting that Boise State linebacker, the Cowboy guy, Leighton Vander Esch vibes from Blake Cashman, which I didn't watch a ton of University of Minnesota games, but that's not where I'd go. I think he's a really, really good Big Ten linebacker. And again, I didn't watch him very closely or intensely, so I could be just way wrong. But my impression is that he's a high-end backup in the NFL. Hopefully I'm wrong, because it would be really dope to see him do really well. But, that was a pretty positive surprise. We were just talking about linebackers, so that's kind of what popped out. But Miles Boykin and Miles Sanders, actually. Miles Boykin, wide receiver, Notre Dame. Miles Sanders, Penn State, running back, who actually the Penn State running back looks a lot like Barkley. He's just not as good, which that doesn't actually tell you very much given how good Barkley is. But, seems to play a very similar style. Had some really good tests. A lot of people talked about DK Metcalf's results, which were to be expected as the most explosive or most interesting at wide receiver. But Miles Boykin had, I think, the best combine of any receiver, and maybe of anybody. Actually, according to the testing I've done, his physical skills translate the best to his position. So I'll go with that. I hadn't heard of this guy. Again, I haven't done a ton of draft work, and I've been later and later every year in terms of this draft work. But he was extraordinary. And he's the closest comp to Calvin Johnson we have physically in terms of the combine testing in this draft. Because Metcalf was so tight on the short shuttle and 3-cone that his scores there are kind of at an all-time low. So, the fact that Metcalf ran a 4.33 at his incredible size, that's historically really amazing. But Boykin was like second in every test. Except for, I think, 3-cone or short shuttle, where he just absolutely demolished anyway. And so he probably had the most surprising combine for somebody that I hadn't heard of coming in. The running backs all disappointed. I liked Justice Hill's workout a ton. That doesn't say much, given that he was like first in basically every workout. But I think the running backs that people were interested in, besides Josh Jacobs, who didn't work out, they're all pretty disappointing. A lot of people were disappointed by Elijah Holyfield, who ran like a 4.8. The faster you are at running back, there's like a diminishing marginal return historically in the NFL. But the slower you are at past like 4.7, if you're slower than 4.7, that's like super meaningful. And so that's like disqualifyingly bad. So that was kind of a big surprise. And then Tyree Jackson running like a 4.5 just blew me out of it. He looks so clunky that I'm kind of shocked, but cool. Good job.
So Kyle Slaby also wanted us to comment on Chris Johnson's conspiracy theory about the 40-yard dash.
I don't why. What's the motivation? I know Slavy's motivation.
Boredom,
we talk about, but I don't know what Chris Johnson's motivation is, or his supposed motivation for the NFL, because it's not like the NFL has it out for him. He's not like Tom Brady, right, where the NFL apparently just hates him enough to start falsifying charges against him.
I suppose if you're a former record holder, for those who don't know the story, John Ross now holds the record for the fastest 40-yard dash ever at the combine. Chris Johnson used to have that ownership of the title, and the video of it is somewhat suspect, not in a loose change sort of way, but it's
if you simulcast it,
if you simulcast it, it looks a little different, it looks a little weird, and his main thing is that they took a long time to try to confirm the time on that, way more than they have ever had done for anybody else. I'm just saying the yellow mark for my 40 was not the same as his yellow mark for his 40, so
right. Well, so that he can be right about the simulcast and be wrong about the existence of a conspiracy, right? So, this has happened before where I think it was Jacoby Jones and Trindon Holiday, where, they both ran insanely fast 40s in different years, and they compared, I believe, Trindon Holiday's 40 to Jacoby Jones, or vice versa, and whoever had just run it ran a faster time officially. But the simulcast actually shows the other one beating him out. This happens. It's not like it just happens, right? 'Cause I don't think the NFL has a conspiracy against Trindon Holiday or whatever, right? It's because the way the timer goes, it's off of the first movement, which is also kind of responsible for Andy Isabella's weird 40 time at first, where he ran a 4.54, which is not bad, but it's also not what you expected, given that he was running 4.27 and 4.26 in his workouts before the combine, and was a track star that outran Denzel Ward in high school and stuff like that. Yeah. So the issue there was the super late start. The combine uses what's called, and I'm not like a track expert, so like, I guess do research or correct me if you've already done the research, but they use HAT, which is half automatic timing, where a person physically begins the timer, and then the laser only measures the end of it. And so it's off of the first movement, which very often is not the first movement forward or the first movement that propels a player. And so the start is a very important thing to coach if you're training people who are going to the combine, because a lot of players will step back, or not even step back. They'll push with their back foot, which is supernatural. Like, it makes a ton of sense to do that. But that takes extra time, but it starts the timer. Where you need to push off with your front foot and just swing your back foot forward without using any force to bring it off the ground. So that gives you a couple of extra seconds, even if it loses you, or not seconds, but hundredths of a second, even though it loses some power off of that initial stroke. So that timing is something that's kind of well worth criticism and has been criticized a lot by people who know a lot about it, which is why I don't hate the hand or manual timing that a lot of people seem to make fun of. Like, I get that like the NFL is behind technologically in a lot of things, and in particular front offices are behind technologically in a lot of things. And so it always feels like if they do something that isn't, technologically sound, or seems technologically sound, it's another reason to make fun of them. But it actually makes a lot of sense, because if you roll forward without lifting either your hands or your feet, that starts the timer, even though it doesn't really measure your speed. So like, from the perspective of like, yeah, I guess it would be unfair for you to be able to get that advantage. If it was a competition, that would make sense, but it's not a competition. It's a measurement. And so it doesn't really measure your speed. And so those things can impact, and it's always these small things, can impact what something will look like off the simulcast, because they don't want to simulcast someone who hasn't gotten out of their break yet. So the simulcast will start as soon as someone's foot moves, right? But the timer won't. So that might be why these things happen. I don't think it's a conspiracy against Chris Johnson. I have no idea why they would want to do that. I don't think it's a conspiracy against Jacoby Jones or Trenton Holiday. It's how you set up the simulcast versus how you time.
Well, there you have it. Slaby, quit asking the damn question. Adam West asks if you had a choice, Fant or Hawkinson.
Hawkinson. I can see why people would prefer Fant. I was in a group discussion today with a couple of draft nicks, and they were saying, you know what, screw it, I like Fant more. And I get it, especially immediately after the combine. Which, again, is not to say if you change your opinion about a player because of the combine, you're doing it wrong, because I think you're doing it right. That's the point of the combine. You just have to do it cautiously and objectively, and in a way that's in accordance with like the evidence we have available to us. That's fine. I'm fine with that. That's the point. But I'm fine with either, right? So Hawkinson, I think a lot of people who prefer Fant, and I'm not saying that's true of the people that I was talking to or of everybody, but a lot of people who prefer Fant, they're of the correct opinion that passing matters more than running, and in particular receiving matters more than run blocking. Fine, that's all true. But that Hawkinson is merely like an average receiver and Fant is an explosive receiver. And while Fant would offer something to the Vikings that they currently don't have at tight end, which is a deep downfield threat that Hawkinson kind of doesn't, and Fant's not a bad blocker either. I think that kind of gets just to kind of balance this conversation about, hey, there's some misconceptions about Hawkinson. There's some misconceptions about Fant. He's a fine blocker. But I think that what Hawkinson does at the catch point and how he runs his routes and all of that is kind of underrated. There's a reason he had more receiving yards this year at Iowa. He's an extraordinary big play tight end that actually did really well at the combine. He's really athletic. He's just not as crazy athletic as Noah Fant. And in addition to that, he is like this monstrously good blocker. And so he is a guy I would compare more to O.J. Howard coming out. Or, I guess stylistically, when we don't have a ton of comparisons between players who are really good, both blockers and receivers. He's, closer to like Gronkowski, right? Which, as soon as you say that, you're like, oh, dude, I want that dude. But like Fant is like Vernon Davis, right? Like that's like pretty good blocker, right? Amazing deep play threat. In different situations, the style that Gronk provides and the style that Vernon Davis provides, they're good for different teams. It just kind of determines it only matters how much relative talent they have. If you're like 80% of Gronk or 90% of Vernon Davis, which one's better? I honestly don't know. If Vernon Davis had kind of had a longer career where he was playing at his peak, we might be having a discussion about how Vernon Davis would be tight end 2 on the all-decade team or something like that. Like he's an extraordinarily good tight end whose peak was only like 4 years or something like that. And, obviously Gronk is like the best tight end of all time. I'll defend that till the day I die. But, stylistically, Hawkinson's more of a Gronk, and I really like that versatility. And not even because run blocking is like good and that I think people underrate it, but also because it gives you, I think, more play calling opportunities where you can more credibly switch out of plays, not just threaten one play and do the other, but like at the line of scrimmage, effectively switch plays in the personnel, whatever personnel you're in. And that was a big reason why the Patriots 2 tight end stuff, 2009, 2010 was so good. It wasn't because they could disguise what they were doing. It's because they could change what they were doing and be equally good at both of them. And I think Hawkinson gives you more opportunities for that. But, if you prefer Fant, that makes a ton of sense to me, too.
Let's go with Michael's question, which is, Mark Rypien and Rich Gannon had great years later in their careers. Were they arguably more talented and lifted their teams, or did moving into the right system with experienced coaches improve their results? And how does Cousins compare?
So Rypien was on an all-time team in 1991 with Washington. Just an incredibly good team that could have gone undefeated. And he was with a bunch of really good players around him. Like 8 of them might have gone to the Pro Bowl or something like that. Just incredible. I think that plays a role. Not to say Rypien's untalented or anything like that. And Rich Gannon, I think, just legitimately got better. And, of course, ended up with a coach that did right by him. I think John Gruden in his MVP year. If not, it was like immediately afterwards. So both of them ended up in situations where they had a really good coaching staff. So that's true for both of them. And then Rypien ended up with a really great roster around him, which is not to say that Gannon didn't get and had a pretty good roster around him too. That's important, but they also were both very good. And I would say that their peaks are probably higher, or their peak was probably higher than Kirk Cousins' peak would be. But that's not a bad direction to take it. I think that that's a really smart way of thinking about it, because we always talk about Cousins in the context of like contemporary quarterbacks, where we've only got a limited number of examples of players who are successful. And right now, I don't think that we've got a bunch of players like Kirk Cousins around that have been successful. Which is not to say that Cousins can't be, but I think historically we have. We've got quarterbacks that do a very, very good job in a situation where they've got a great cast around them that would do a better job than a lot of quarterbacks, even though those quarterbacks would perform better in less ideal situations because like this talent doesn't scale linearly. And so that's not a bad place to go. I would still say that those two were probably better when they were playing at their peak, although it took a while to get there, than Cousins will be at his. But that's not to say, A, that I'm completely confident in that, or B, that they can't, get to that point. So, yeah, I mean, I like it. Gannon had, Gannon had a great supporting cast too. So yeah, that's really interesting. Thielen and Diggs are not quite like, Art Monk or anything like that, but yeah, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, they're both really good.
That's a hell of a thing to strive for, if nothing else. I believe Monk actually made it into the Hall of Fame, so.
Yeah, it took a while, but yeah.
Yeah. Corey Rug has, I think, my favorite question of the mailbag. What's the most Minnesota-specific test you would make prospects do for an interview?
The interviews happen in hotel rooms, and so you can control the temperature of those hotel rooms. So I would drop the temperature as much as I could. I mean, we're already starting with the premise that these interviews are meaningful, so let's pretend they are. I would drop the temperature as much as I could, and every coach or everybody in there is in a t-shirt, and I'll just like wait to see how the prospect reacts to just how insanely cold it is. Also, give him a beverage with ice.
It is actually just ice at that point.
Yeah, it's just ice.
This was warm about 20 minutes ago, but you were running late.
But yeah, and the most Minnesotan version of that is to not mention it at all.
Oh no, complete passive aggressiveness. No, yeah. that would be
and see how these prospects react to how crazy cold it is. Because it would be, and just conduct the interview normally. And if they complain about the cold or, I don't know, ask for a coat. I don't know.
Just point to a giant blown up picture of Bud Grant.
Right. Just have that in the room. Don't even just look at it as soon as the prospect says something, but don't. Yeah. So yeah, that would probably be the most Minnesota test I could think of.
I wish there was some way you could make them start a snowblower and run it for 5 minutes and then realize you're out of gas, but you can't get the car out because it's already blocked by snow. So you have to figure out another way of shoveling it, and the whole thing, not just the side the car is on. If we had some version of that.
Right. But I mean, that would be difficult to do in a hotel. So that was actually my first thought, was to figure out a solution for a car stuck in snow. We were completely on the same wave there, but then I had to change tacks and think about, well, what would you do in an interview room? So that's what I do in an interview. But I 100% agree. There would be problem solving implements nearby. Obviously, a shovel, some sand. But you would point it out. They would have to figure it out. It's somewhere in the car, right?
Is there some? I realize this is the second time I've gone to a video game question when talking about combine interview stuff. But if there was some virtual a simulator of you've gotten your truck or your vehicle stuck in the snow, how are you going to rock it out?
Right. Yeah. That would be
creative.
Yeah.
Linval is also in the car.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking that ruins the second part of the test, which is sometimes you just gotta give a prospect points for the brute force answer, which is to push the car out. And if they could just do that on their own, that would be pretty amazing. You'd be like, yeah, I don't really care about problem solving skills at this point.
No.
But if Linval's in the car, never mind.
And Linval is hungry. He's not actually hungry. He's hangry. You guys need to make it to Chipotle. So Eddie asks a question. It's kind of a question. You don't need to be active on Twitter very long to realize there are rivalries and disagreements in the draft community. Do these tensions ever manifest somewhere, like the Combine or Senior Bowl? Can it be as cliquey as Twitter? If there's awkwardness, how do you handle it?
So yeah, it can be pretty cliquey. It very often doesn't manifest at a place like the Combine because
it's easier to be tough online than it is in person.
Well, yeah, but I think more importantly, one side of the greater Twitter debate, the greater draft debate, isn't at the Combine. So the analytics people don't often get credentialed to go to the Combine. So you don't see them there. I mean, there are some exceptions. I mean, Josh Hermsmeyer was credentialed for 538, so he was there. I didn't notice. Actually, I didn't see him a ton, so maybe he just avoided everybody, and maybe I'm wrong. But I didn't notice any particular tension there. But I mean, yeah, I mean, there's schools of thought, and they kind of, and the schools of thought kind of manifest themselves in the interpersonal disagreements on Twitter, and people kind of stay away from each other. But honestly, it's not that big, and there hasn't been a ton of tension. I just think, if there's some bad blood between some people, they just don't interact. At the Combine, there's so many people there that you can just choose not to interact with some people. I floated between maybe only 5 different groups of people, and that wasn't even because I was trying to avoid anybody. But it's very easy if you want to avoid someone. So yeah, at the Senior Bowl, kind of the same thing.
At the Senior Bowl, you're just trying not to get punched up by a head coach from any of the teams.
Right. Yeah. They tend to group together, which, I mean, it makes it tough for me, right? Because I'm trying to talk to everybody. So I'm so a lot of times at the Senior Bowl, I'm just walking up and down bleachers so I can like see and talk to people that I haven't seen for a year. And so other people are kind of clumped together, and I kind of hate that. But there's not like a ton of tension. People might be fake nice to each other, I guess. But yeah.
No Ben Albright to I guess celebrate his unblocking of people.
Yeah, Albright was at the Senior Bowl. I only saw him on like the third day or whatever. He was holding court with like a bunch of people. There were a bunch of people around him. That's kind of funny.
He was actually just getting to know all the people he had unblocked.
Yeah, it's like, oh, did I block you? Oh, interesting. I'm not going to fix that, but interesting.
Kenneth Allen asks, if you had to do the combine drills, which drills would you at least suck at, or would you least suck at, and which would you most suck at? Would you manage to crack the 1 percentile at any of them?
So presuming a world where I don't like fall flat on my face, and then I'd like worked out for at least a month. I was a pretty fast dude in high school, like legitimately fast.
Yeah, you just can't run backwards. It's fine on concrete.
I was running forwards. That's the most embarrassing part.
Oh, that's tragic.
Yeah. But in a world where I like consistently work out, I'm probably not falling over.
In a world where you're in complete control of all of your extremities.
I was so unused to like. So now I'm working out like a little bit more regularly, but at the time we did that, I was so unused to like moving that like I felt like my torso disconnect from my hip. Like I was like, this is bad. And that's when I like overbalanced and fell over.
You were like a baby giraffe at that point.
Yeah, right. I was just like, I'm not used to this. Hello, ground. By the way, everybody do judo for like at least just like a month. I strongly recommend it. The most important thing judo has ever taught me is how to fall. It's so important. That's not even a joke. Like you distribute the impact of your weight across multiple things. You intuitively begin to learn how to protect your head, and you don't like just stick out your hands and shock your wrists and elbows. So strongly recommend that. Saved me from a ton of injury in that situation and in some other situations. But aside from that, I think my best would probably be the short shuttle. Not because I am short, but because my thing was quickness, and also it helps that you're short. But yeah, I think I'm pretty quick, especially if I can train. I think obviously I'd be the worst at the bench press.
See, I would because of my height, I think I could do the jump. I think I could do the jump with the with the hand mark up. I think I can already touch the rim. So of a basketball
I think they like adjust that to your height though. Like they like know how tall you are.
Well, like as long as 10 feet is up there, I can hit 10 feet. I might be able to hit like 10 foot, like 1 or 2 or whatever, but I'd still be able to hit like.
Well, for you, that's like a 48-inch vert though. That's like not. Well, that's actually huge. Never mind.
I still, despite my fat, I can still jump up in the air apparently. Beef Brewski asks, will Colton ever come back, or is he still wandering the forests of Portugal?
Oh yeah, no, he's lost. He's done.
I wondered how long it was going to take for Bachelor questions. Don from Ohio asks, when will Matthew Collar be on the show? And can we get a full hour of Arif and Matthew reading their hate tweets, then insult those people who tweeted them?
That's pretty good. Yeah, put it on the list. Like, I'll discuss that.
We need an April Fool's Day episode this year.
There you go.
Last year we did the Property Brothers, so we'll move on.
Shockingly well received.
Who knew? that might be my favorite. My favorite 2 episodes we've ever done are the 2009 NFC Championship game and then the Property Brothers episode.
I forget how, like, did I spell out the URL on the show? Like, is that, like, how did we get people to go to this random,
it was
questionably legal stream?
I think it was also put in the show notes. So, like, I'd have to check. I'm not. I don't live in the past, so I'm not gonna pull up the page. But yeah, I think those 2 might be my favorite episodes, and that really says something about me. Also, scenario: DK Metcalf gets to hit Arif at full speed from 10 yards out. The only protection Arif is allowed is his Captain America t-shirt. I hope you're wearing pants for this. Every time Arif gets up, his beloved James Madison team gets to beat NDSU in the championship game 47-0, and Metcalf will ring the doorbell of Eric Thompson and Matthew Cryer and tell them to suck it. How many hits is Arif willing to take so that his beloved James Madison University can beat NDSU year after year?
I mean, one, you can't consent if you're unconscious, right? So I'd only be able to take one.
I'm reminded of the Jackass with Jared Allen. Like, yeah. I feel like that's what this is gonna like.
Yeah, that's exactly what it would be. Yeah,
and Johnny Knoxville definitely got a concussion from that.
Oh yeah. I will say this: I took a bunch of hits playing football. Like, I can take a hit. I don't know if I can repeatedly take a hit from like the top 0.01% athlete in the world, but you know, I'm not a wimp. I'd probably die.
But it would mean that your beloved James Madison,
lifelong fan of the Dukes, a team that I follow.
A team that you follow. Let's wrap it up with Bill Bodke. Says, I know Arif is a big AAF fan. Let's suppose the Vikings decide to solve all their problems with a set of cheap AAF all-stars. Who would the Vikings want to sign for? And then we just go down the list. Offensive line, linebacker, interior defensive line, third wide receiver, backup quarterback, backup running back. Thanks for a great show.
Okay, what's the first one?
Offensive line.
Ryan Cummings. No jokes. He's the right guard for the Salt Lake Stallions. He is, in my opinion, I don't think PFF agrees actually, but he is, in my opinion, the best guard in the league. He has allowed like 2 pressures over the course of the past couple of weeks, and the Vikings, obviously, they need a guard. I think he's a starting. I mean, he's really good. He might be a starting quality guard, but if not, I mean, he's a really cheap backup.
All right, next one is going to be linebacker.
Probably Terrence Garvin. I probably, before I like super commit to that answer, I'd probably have to do like, more research or whatever. But, he's one of the few linebackers that can both rush the passer and cover, which, that's a rarity. So there's that. Other than that, Trevor Riley is weirdly good. But I'll go with Terrence Garvin.
All right. After linebacker, we're going to interior defensive line.
That's a problem. Most of these good interior defenders, people like Julius Wormsley, Mike Purcell, Jalen Robinson, they're like nose tackles, or old, like Mike Purcell is like 28, I think. Trenton Thompson is a nose tackle. Maybe Casey Sales, the Birmingham defensive end. I mean, he's really an interior defender. So probably him. He's kind of leading. I think he's leading the league in pressures from a defensive interior, so he'd be a good one. And he's only like 23 or 24, so that'd be good.
All right, after interior defensive line, we have the third wide receiver.
Charles Johnson, easy. Not even just because he's like a former Viking. He's like way better than everybody in that league. Like, he shouldn't be in that league.
Like, it's one of those things where it almost seems silly that he's not like on the Panthers or something.
Right. Yeah. There's 2. So I'll freebie. There's 2 players that are clearly NFL quality players that are just eating people alive in the AAF. One of them is Charles Johnson. The other one is DeMontre Moore, who's just like feasting on these like poor tackles. He's like leading the league in like hits and sacks, and well, not sacks anymore because he had to miss part of the game. But in total pressures and stuff like that, he's just like consuming offensive linemen whole.
So after that, we have the backup quarterback.
There's like 3 good quarterbacks in the AAF. Garrett Gilbert, he's probably more of a system product than anyone else that's doing well. But Luis Perez has gotten worse every week. I haven't watched week 4, so maybe I'm wrong about that, but it sounded like he wasn't killing it. And then John Wolford has declined a little bit. Josh Woodrum from Salt Lake has gotten a lot better. But Gilbert's the only one that's consistently performed well. And I think a lot of that has to do with Steve Spurrier and Charles Johnson. But, you might as well, especially if you have Charles Johnson.
And finally, the backup running back.
But Terrell Presley would be really easy to say. But Kenneth Farrow, if Mike Boone is on the roster, Kenneth Farrow, because I think that he can be your goal line back. He's been extraordinarily good through contact without fumbling the ball, like Trent Richardson. Also, I don't think Trent Richardson's actually been that good. He's just gotten the ball a lot inside the 10. And so he has a lot of touchdowns, but he's averaging like 2.5 yards a carry, which is very Trent Richardson. But, like if I don't have Mike Boone, Jaquan Gardner would be a really great pass catching back. But I mean, it sounds like you want to have kind of a diverse array of potential running backs. And so I'd probably go with Kenneth Farrow, who's averaging like 5 yards a carry, and a lot of it after contact.
Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Arif, what do you have to plug for us?
So I already mentioned a couple of times at The Athletic, I've got the offensive players already up about the offensive players that have met the Vikings thresholds. I will have the defensive players up very soon. I'm finishing that article now. Again, I had to fix something with the defensive ends. Otherwise, that would be hilariously long. But yeah, and then also, like, I'm going to be going back on the AAF beat. So week 5 is going to be a little bit different than most of the AAF articles I've written.
Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We'll look forward to seeing you probably in about 2 weeks or so. So for Reef, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember to tweet that, even if it is a work in progress. And we'll see you soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.